Keep your head down, Mara's mother had whispered that morning, as if the words could hide her from the world. But the market square was already full, bright with winter light and lined with nobles in fur-trimmed coats, all of them watching the auction platform like it was a stage built for their amusement. Mara stood at the edge of the crowd with her hands folded tight, her worn gray dress pulled close against the cold. She was not there because she wanted to be seen. She was there because her family had nothing left, and the only way to pay the pack tax was to sell the silver ring her father had left behind. Yet even with that small hope in her pocket, she still felt the same old weight settle over her shoulders when the whispers began. "That's the rejected Omega," someone muttered. "The one no wolf would claim." Mara's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes lowered. She had learned long ago that looking back only made people crueler. On the platform, the auction master raised his voice, calling for bids on grain, timber, and iron tools, while behind him a pair of servants dragged forward a covered cage wrapped in dark cloth. A low murmur moved through the square. Every head turned. The auction master gave a strained smile and lifted the cloth just enough to reveal a lone white wolf pup inside, trembling so hard its thin legs nearly folded beneath it. The animal was small, underfed, and frightened enough to whine when the wind touched its fur. "Wild pup," the auction master announced. "Found near the northern ridge." No owner came forward. "We start at $20. A few people laughed. One noblewoman covered her nose. "It looks sickly," she said, as if the pup could hear her. Another man snorted. "Probably useless. Let the thing be sent out of the county." The laughter rolled through the square, sharp and careless. Mara should have stayed still. She knew that. She knew what happened to girls who drew attention from the wrong crowd. But when the pup tried to stand and slipped against the bars, something inside her moved before fear could stop it. She stepped forward. One step, then another. The guards noticed her immediately, their expressions changing from boredom to suspicion. "You," one of them said. "Back away." Mara swallowed. Her voice came out soft, but clear. "How long has it been out here?" The guard blinked at the question, thrown off by how little she sounded like someone begging for permission. The auction master frowned. "Since dawn," he said. "No one wants it." Mara looked at the pup again. Its ears drooped. Its breathing shivered in the cold. She could not explain why the sight hurt so much, only that it did. "I'll take it," she said. A ripple of laughter broke out at once. "You," a voice mocked. "The rejected Omega? She can barely feed herself. Now she wants a wolf pup?" Mara felt every word like a pinch beneath the skin, but she did not move. She reached into her coat and pulled out the silver ring, the last thing her father had left her. It caught the light in her palm. "It's worth more than 20, she said. "Enough for the pup." The auction master stared at the ring, then at her face, and something uneasy flickered behind his eyes. The crowd grew quieter, not because they were kind, but because they loved watching a fool make herself known. Mara lifted her chin just enough to meet the pup's gaze through the bars. Its eyes were pale, almost gold, and for one strange heartbeat the world seemed to still around them. The pup stopped trembling. Its ears tipped forward. Then, from somewhere beyond the square, a deep male voice cut through the noise like a blade of winter air. "That pup is not for sale." Every head turned. The servants froze. Even the auction master went rigid. A tall man stood at the far end of the square in a dark traveling cloak, his hood shadowing most of his face, but not the impossible calm in his posture. He looked ordinary at first glance, just another traveler passing through the town. Yet the crowd parted around him anyway, as if something in his presence demanded space. Mara's fingers tightened around the ring. The stranger's gaze found the cage, then settled on her with a look that felt oddly knowing. And then the air changed. Not loudly, not all at once. Just enough for every wolf in the square to feel it. Mara saw it first in the faces around her. The sudden silence, the way shoulders stiffened, the way even the mocking smiles began to fade. The stranger inhaled once, slow and deep, and his eyes sharpened with recognition. But then the room changed. Mara could not move. The square felt too small for the sudden weight of that stranger's silence, and yet every instinct in her body told her he was the only thing in it that was real. The auction master swallowed hard and tried to recover his voice, but the words caught in his throat. One of the guards stepped forward, then stopped as the stranger lifted a hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was worse than that. It was calm, certain, final. "This sale is over," he said, and the crowd reacted as if the ground itself had shifted beneath their feet. Mara stared at him through the bars of the cage, unable to understand why her chest hurt so sharply at the sound of his voice. It was low and even, with a strange warmth buried beneath the command in it. Not cruel, not mocking, familiar in a way she could not explain. The auction master rushed into a nervous smile. "Sir, perhaps you did not hear. This girl has been listed for transfer." The stranger did not even look at him. His gaze remained on Mara, steady enough to make the rest of the world blur. "Open the cage," he said quietly. No one moved. The guards glanced at one another, waiting for permission that did not come. Mara could see the man in the cloak more clearly now, or at least enough to notice the way he stood, as if he had never once needed to ask anyone for anything in his life. There was power in that stillness. Not loud power. The kind that made others yield before it ever spoke again. "I said open it," he repeated, and this time the square seemed to hold its breath. One guard finally fumbled for the key. The lock clicked. The door swung open with a soft groan, and Mara flinched even though no one touched her. She had spent so long bracing for humiliation that kindness felt almost more dangerous. The stranger moved closer, stopping just outside the cage as if he understood that one careless step could send her fleeing. "Are you hurt?" he asked. The question was so simple that it nearly undid her. No one had asked her that in years. Not with sincerity. Not with eyes like that. She shook her head once, though it was not entirely true. Her wrists ached. Her pride ached more. But the stranger seemed to read the truth in the tiny tremor of her hands. His jaw tightened, just slightly, and the crowd behind him stirred uneasily. Mara heard whispers beginning to rise again, confused and fearful now. "Who is he? Why is everyone afraid? He is not one of ours." The auction master took a breath, then tried to laugh. It came out thin and brittle. "Perhaps the gentleman would like to make a proper offer." The stranger finally turned his head, just enough for the firelight to catch the hard line of his profile beneath the hood. "You are still speaking," he said. The master went pale. Silence dropped like a cloak over the square. Mara looked at the stranger again, at the disciplined stillness of his shoulders, at the way every wolf in the crowd avoided meeting his eyes. Something deep and ancient moved under her skin, not fear exactly, but the strange sensation of standing before a door she had never known existed. Then he reached for the cage door and held it open himself. "Come here," he said softly. Mara hesitated. She did not trust easy mercy. Life had taught her that even gentle hands could close into chains. But his expression did not change. There was no impatience in him, no hunger, no amusement. Only patience. Only a quiet command that felt almost like safety. Slowly, she stepped forward. The world seemed to pause around that one small movement. When her bare foot touched the dirt outside the cage, the stranger extended a cloak toward her. The fabric was dark and warm from his body, and when she took it, his fingers brushed hers for the briefest instant. A strange current passed through her, subtle and immediate, as if something old had stirred awake in both of them at once. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion but in recognition so deep it looked almost like pain. Mara did not understand what she saw there. She only knew that for the first time in a very long time, someone was looking at her as if she mattered. And somewhere in the crowd, a wolf dropped to one knee. Then another. The stranger did not take his eyes off Mara as the square fell into total silence, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "At last," he said, as though he had been waiting for her all his life. The silence in the square did not break all at once. It thinned first, like ice starting to crack under a hidden current, and every wolf present seemed to feel it. Mara stood under the borrowed cloak with her shoulders drawn in, her bare feet pressing into the cool dirt, as if she were afraid the ground might reject her too. She could still feel the faint heat of the stranger's fingers against hers, a touch so brief it should not have meant anything, and yet her heart would not settle. It beat too hard, too fast, as though some distant part of her had recognized him before her mind could catch up. The stranger remained still, his gaze fixed on her with a gravity that made the air feel heavier around them. He did not look at her the way the others had. There was no pity in his face, no amusement, no polite distance. There was only intent, and something far older than intent, something that made Mara's skin prickle beneath the cloak. Around them, wolves lowered their heads one by one. Not because they were told to, but because they could not seem to do otherwise. Mara noticed it with a quiet shock. The same crowd that had mocked her moments ago had gone rigid, their mouths closed, their eyes lowered, their certainty gone. She did not know what had changed. She only knew that the square felt different now, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath a truth no one else was willing to name. The stranger finally moved. Not toward the crowd, toward her. Every step he took was unhurried, yet it carried the kind of authority that made the air seem to part. He stopped just close enough for Mara to see the gold flecks hidden in his dark eyes, and when he reached out, she did not pull away. His hand lifted the edge of the cloak at her shoulder with a care that startled her. It was the gentleness of the gesture that nearly undid her. No one had ever touched her, as if she might break, without meaning to. No one had ever made gentleness feel like something powerful. His voice, when it came, was low enough that only she could hear it. "You should not have been brought here like this." Mara swallowed, her throat tight. She did not know what answer he expected, only that her silence felt thin beneath the weight of his attention. He studied her for one long moment, and then his expression shifted, not into surprise, but into certainty. It was a certainty that unsettled her more than any accusation could have. The elder who had ordered the cage stepped forward at last, recovering enough to find his voice. He lifted his chin toward the stranger and tried to speak with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "You have no right to interfere." The stranger did not even look at him. That alone seemed to drain the elder of color. "She is not cargo," he said, each word measured in quiet. "And she will not be spoken of as if she were less than human." The square absorbed the sentence in complete stillness. Mara felt it travel through her like warmth returning to cold hands. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. She had learned long ago that tears were often treated like proof of weakness. So she only held the cloak tighter and looked at the stranger as if he were a horizon she had never dared to imagine. Behind him, the wolves remained kneeling. Mara did not know why, but the sight shook something loose inside her chest. The stranger turned back to her then, and for one impossible instant, the hard lines of his face softened. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was so simple that it nearly hurt. No one in that square had asked her name in years. Mara opened her mouth. Before she could answer, the elder spoke again, sharper this time, trying to reclaim control from a moment that had already escaped him. "She has no place among us." The stranger's eyes moved, slow and dangerous, and when they settled on the elder, the man took an involuntary step back. "Then perhaps," the stranger said, his voice calm as snowfall and twice as final, "it is your place that is no longer secure." Mara felt the weight of that promise before she understood it. It was not cruelty she heard in him. It was protection. Steady, certain, absolute. And for the first time in her life, the word felt like something that could be real. She drew a slow breath beneath the cloak and answered in a voice so soft it almost disappeared into the air. "Mara." The stranger repeated her name once, as though tasting the shape of it, and something in his expression changed again. It was small, but Mara saw it. A flicker of recognition, a flicker of memory, as if her name had reached some hidden place inside him and awakened something sleeping there. The crowd did not move. No one dared. The stranger lowered his hand from her shoulder, but the warmth of it seemed to remain. Then he inclined his head toward her with a formality that felt older than the square itself. "Mara," he said, "come with me." And though she did not yet know who he was, or why every wolf in the square had bowed when he entered, or why the air had gone electric the moment he touched her, she knew one thing with startling clarity. Her life had just crossed a threshold she would never be able to step back across. Mara let herself be led away, though every instinct in her body still trembled from the silence of the square and the weight of 1,000 staring eyes. The stranger did not hurry her. He moved with the calm certainty of someone who had never once needed to prove he belonged anywhere. His hand brushed lightly at the back of her elbow, steady and respectful, and that quiet restraint unsettled her more than force ever could. Around them, the crowd parted in uneasy waves. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe too loudly. Mara kept her gaze lowered as they crossed the square, but she could feel the shift in the air behind her, the way whispers began and died the moment he turned his head. He did not look back. He did not need to. The whole place seemed to bend around him as though the world itself knew better than to challenge him. When they reached the edge of the square, she finally found her voice. "Who are you?" The question came out softer than she intended, fragile against the stillness between them. He did not answer at once. Instead, he glanced toward the narrow path leading beyond the market stalls, where the trees stood dark and waiting at the far side of the road. Only then did he look at her. His expression was unreadable, but not cold. There was something in it that felt controlled, carefully held back, like a fire contained behind glass. "Someone who has been looking for you," he said. Mara stared at him. The words should have comforted her. Instead, they stirred something deeper, something uncertain and strangely heavy in her chest. Looking for her. No one ever looked for Mara unless they wanted something she had no right to refuse. She had learned that early. A woman like her was rarely sought out with kindness. Usually, she was only noticed when she could be blamed, or used, or sent away. Yet this man stood before her with a patience that felt impossible to fake. He was watching her the way people watch fragile things they did not want to break. That realization made her uneasy in a different way. They passed under the line of old birch trees near the road, where the light thinned and softened into silver. There, away from the crowd, the world felt quieter, as if the square had belonged to one life, and this path belonged to another. Mara noticed the details then, because she could not help herself. The fine cut of his coat, the expensive leather of his boots, clean despite the dust of the road. The faint scent that clung to him, sharp and clean and impossibly distant, like cold pine after rain. It was not the scent of a common man. It was not the scent of anyone she was meant to stand beside. Yet he had touched her shoulder as though she belonged in his world. Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask again who he was, but something in her warned her that answers, once spoken, could not be taken back. At last, they reached a carriage waiting beneath the trees. It was dark and polished, its doors marked with a simple silver crest that Mara did not recognize. The driver stood near the wheel with his head bowed, not speaking, not looking up. The stranger stopped beside the carriage and turned toward her. "You can refuse," he said quietly. The words caught her off guard. She had expected command. She had expected pressure. Instead, he offered her choice, and that choice felt more dangerous than any order. Mara lifted her chin just enough to meet his eyes. For one brief moment, she saw something there that made her breath catch, something ancient and lonely beneath the composure. It vanished almost as soon as she saw it, hidden again behind discipline and stillness. "If I go with you," she asked, "will I understand why everyone bowed?" His gaze did not waver. "Soon," he said, "but not here." The answer was not enough. It was also, strangely, exactly enough to keep her from turning away. So Mara stepped toward the carriage, one careful step at a time, with the feeling that she was walking not into danger, but into a truth that had been waiting for her far longer than she had ever known. And just as her fingers touched the door, the distant bells of the square began to ring behind them, slow and solemn, as if announcing the beginning of something no one there could yet name. Mara had not expected the carriage to stop before the forest gate. Yet there it was, waiting beneath the fading light like a dark breath held in the trees. The bells from the square still lingered in the distance, soft and solemn, while the world around her seemed to grow quieter with each step she took beside him. He did not hurry her. He simply walked at her pace, his silence steady, his presence impossible to ignore. Mara kept her hands folded tightly in front of her, as if she could hold her thoughts in place by force alone. She wanted to ask a dozen questions. Why had the council bowed? Why had the guards looked at him with such careful respect? Why did everyone speak around him as though one wrong word might wake something ancient and dangerous? But when she turned to look at him, he was not watching the path. He was watching her, as if he had been waiting for her to gather the courage to speak. There was no impatience in his face, no cruelty, no amusement. Only patience. It unsettled her more than if he had smiled. The carriage door remained open behind them. The driver stood back at a respectful distance, eyes lowered. Mara noticed then how even the horses had gone still, ears angled forward, calm in a way she could not explain. The air felt changed here, cleaner somehow, but also charged, like the breath before a storm. "You said I would understand soon," she said at last, her voice low so it would not carry. Was that meant to comfort me? Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, but it did not last. "No," he said. "It was meant to prepare you." She frowned, unsure whether she liked that answer. "For what?" He looked past her toward the gate, where the trees had begun to gather into a single long shadow. "For the truth." The words settled between them with more weight than she expected. Truth. Mara had spent most of her life learning that truth was a dangerous thing. Truth made people look away. Truth made people cruel. Truth made her mother flinch and her neighbors whisper, and her own reflection seem smaller than it was. So why did his voice make the words sound less like a threat and more like an opening door? The faint sound of bells drifted again from the square, then faded beneath the rustle of leaves. Somewhere deeper in the woods, a bird called once and then went silent. Mara drew in a careful breath. "If the truth is so important," she said, "why has no one told me anything?" He was quiet for a moment, as though weighing not the answer itself, but the shape of it. "Because some truths are not meant to be handed over in daylight," he said. "They are meant to be found." His words sent a strange shiver through her. She looked down at her own hands, at the faint dust on her fingers from the road, at the simple fabric of her sleeves that had once made her feel invisible. Here, beside him, she felt both painfully ordinary and strangely seen. It was as if he looked at the parts of her everyone else ignored and found them worth waiting for. That thought frightened her more than the carriage, more than the forest, more than the solemn bow of every guard in the square. A gust of wind moved through the trees, lifting a strand of hair against her cheek. He noticed it. Without thinking, Mara reached up to tuck it back. His eyes followed the motion, and for the briefest second, something unguarded crossed his face. It was gone before she could name it, but it left her with the unsettling certainty that he was carrying some private burden of his own. Not the burden of a powerful man untouched by the world. Something older, deeper, lonelier. "You keep looking at me like you know me," she whispered before she could stop herself. His answer came after a pause long enough to make her pulse quicken. "I know enough," he said. That was not a refusal. It was not a confession. It was worse. It was promise. The forest gate stood open now, its iron posts dark against the evening sky. Beyond it, the road vanished into the trees, and the trees seemed to lean inward, as if listening. Mara felt the moment tighten around her, thin as glass and ready to break. She should have stepped back. She should have demanded answers. Instead, she found herself moving closer to the carriage door, as if the pull of whatever waited ahead was stronger than fear. The man beside her extended a hand, not in command, but in quiet offering. Mara stared at it for a heartbeat, then placed her fingers in his palm. His touch was warm, steady, and impossibly gentle. The contrast of that gentleness with everything around him made her chest ache for reasons she did not understand. He closed his hand lightly around hers, and together they crossed the threshold into the trees. Behind them, the bells in the square rang one last time, and Mara had the sudden, certain feeling that something in her life had just changed forever. The trees swallowed the last light from the square, and for a while, all Mara could hear was the soft creak of the carriage wheels and the hush of branches moving overhead. The path had narrowed into a dim ribbon of earth, and every time the lantern swung, silver flashes crossed the man's face beside her. He did not speak. He only kept his hand around hers, as if he knew she was afraid to let the moment go. Mara did not understand why that simple kindness felt so rare, so startling. Back home, silence had usually meant judgment. In the village, people looked at her as though she were something to be corrected, something to be hidden. But here, in the dark woods, no one was asking her to shrink. The man glanced at her once, his expression unreadable in the shifting lantern glow. "You can let go if you want," he said quietly. Mara looked down at their joined hands. Let go. The word should have felt easy. Instead, they landed inside her like a weight. She realized, with a strange ache, that she did not want to. So she shook her head, barely. His fingers tightened once, not possessive, only reassuring, and the carriage rolled on. Deeper into the trees, the air changed. It grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine, rain, and something faint beneath it, something warm and wild that made the hairs on Mara's arms lift. She lifted her gaze toward the dark beyond the lantern light and saw movement between the trunks. Not animals. Not exactly. Figures stood there, still as stone, watching the road from the shadows. Mara's breath caught. The man beside her felt it instantly. His posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a door closing softly in a storm. He did not look afraid. He looked alert, protective. The carriage slowed. Ahead, through the trees, a wide iron gate emerged from the darkness, taller than any gate Mara had ever seen, its surface marked with old, silver symbols that shimmered when the lantern passed over them. Beyond it, she could make out the outline of a great house, all high windows and pale stone, hidden deep within the forest like a secret the world had tried to forget. Mara sat very still. The place was not a cottage, not an inn, not anything she had imagined. It was too large, too silent, too careful in the way it stood in the dark, as if it had been waiting for her long before she arrived. "Where are we?" she asked. Her voice sounded smaller than she intended. The man did not answer at once. His thumb brushed once across her knuckles, a barely there motion, as though steadying himself as much as her. Then he said, "Somewhere safe." The words should have comforted her. Instead, they deepened the mystery. Safe from what? Safe for whom? The gate began to open before the driver touched it, slow and smooth, with a low metallic groan that echoed through the trees like a warning and an invitation at the same time. Mara felt every instinct in her body sharpen. Fear and curiosity rose together, knotted tight. She wanted to pull back. She wanted to ask the questions burning in her throat. But the man beside her stepped forward first, still holding her hand, and the entire hidden estate seemed to wake around them. Lights glowed in upper windows one by one. Somewhere in the distance, a door opened. A hush moved through the waiting dark, and when the carriage crossed into the grounds, Mara had the distinct, unnerving sense that she was no longer being taken somewhere new. She was being brought home to something she had never known she was meant to find. The carriage rolled to a stop beneath a canopy of ancient oaks, and Mara had to steady herself before she could even step down. The hidden estate rose before her in quiet grandeur, all pale stone and warm amber windows, with ivy curling along the walls like it had been there for centuries. It was beautiful in the way old songs were beautiful, carrying both comfort and a warning. The man beside her released her hand only long enough to open the carriage door, then offered it again with that same calm certainty she had not yet learned how to read. "You are safe here," he said softly. Mara looked at him, trying to decide whether to believe him. Safety had never arrived dressed in velvet and moonlight. Safety had always been something she had to fight for, or something she lost before she could hold on to it. Still, there was something in his voice that made her shoulders loosen a fraction. Not trust, not yet, but a pause before fear. As she stepped onto the gravel path, the crunch beneath her shoes seemed far too loud in the silence. Servants stood at a distance near the main stair, heads lowered, their stillness so practiced it felt ceremonial. None of them spoke. None of them looked directly at her. Mara felt the weight of their attention anyway, the same old sensation of being measured and quietly found lacking. She smoothed her hands over the front of her dress, suddenly aware of how plain it was beside the elegance of the estate. The man noticed. Of course he did. His gaze flicked to her hands, then back to her face, and there was no judgment in it. Only attention. Care. It unsettled her more than mockery would have. They entered through doors tall enough to make her feel small, and the warmth inside the hall wrapped around her like a living thing. Firelight glowed from chandeliers overhead. A polished floor reflected the soft movement of candle flames. Somewhere deeper in the house, water ran through hidden stone channels with a faint, soothing murmur. Mara slowed without meaning to. Every detail of the place seemed arranged to be seen, but not understood all at once. It had the feeling of a house that kept secrets well and had never once been afraid of them. "This way," the man said, and led her past portraits in gold frames, past a staircase curving upward into shadow, past two guards who stepped aside the moment he approached. Mara caught the briefest exchange in their faces, a silent respect so complete it was almost disbelief. She turned her head slightly, trying to place him in this world, but nothing fit. He was too calm for a servant, too familiar with the halls for a guest, too protected to be a stranger. And the way the others moved around him, careful and deferential, made something inside her tighten with unease. They stopped before a pair of tall doors at the end of the corridor. The man reached for the handle, then glanced back at her as if he could feel the questions pressing against her silence. "Whatever you think you know," he said, his voice low, is only the surface. Mara frowned, heart beating harder now. Then tell me what is underneath. For a moment, he did not answer. The torchlight shifted across his face, drawing out the sharp line of his jaw, the exhaustion he had been hiding, and something deeper beneath it, something ancient and restrained. Then he opened the doors. The room beyond was vast and dim, lit by a ring of candles set along the walls. In the center stood a long table, maps spread across it, silver cups untouched, and at the far end, beneath a crest carved in dark wood, sat a man Mara had not seen clearly in the carriage, but whose presence she felt before she understood it. Every person in the room lowered their gaze at once. The air changed. Even the silence seemed to bow. Mara's breath caught. The man beside her stepped aside just enough for the candlelight to find the one at the table, and the truth moved through her like a sudden chill. She did not need anyone to say his name. She saw it in the way the room surrendered to him. She saw it in the stillness of the guards, the reverence of the servants, the impossible weight of command that settled over everything without a word. And when the seated man lifted his eyes to her, slow and unreadable, Mara understood with a shiver that she had just walked into the heart of a power far greater than the dark woods outside. He studied her as if he had been waiting, as if her arrival had not surprised him at all. And in that steady, watchful silence, Mara felt the first fragile thread of fate draw tight between them. Mara did not move at first. The room had gone so still that even her own breathing felt too loud, and yet the quiet did not frighten her as much as the man at the table did. He sat with an ease that did not belong to ordinary men, one hand resting near a silver goblet, the other folded loosely against the dark fabric at his sleeve. There was no wasted motion in him, no restless curiosity, only a steady attention that made Mara feel seen in a way that was almost disarming. The man beside her gave a polite bow and said nothing more, as if the rest had already been understood. Mara swallowed and lowered her eyes for a brief moment, but the weight of that first gaze did not leave her. It lingered like warmth against the skin, calm and impossible to ignore. Around the table, faces remained carefully composed. Servants moved with quiet precision. Guards stood at the walls as still as carved stone. Yet beneath the polished order of the chamber, Mara could feel a tension she did not understand, as if everyone in the room was waiting for a single word from the man who had not yet spoken. She had seen power before. She had seen people try to look larger than they were, louder than they were, crueler than they were. This was different. This power did not need to announce itself. It lived in the silence between heartbeats. It lived in the way no one dared interrupt him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, carrying easily through the chamber without effort. You may come closer. The words were simple. They should have sounded ordinary. Instead, they landed with a strange gentleness that made Mara's chest tighten. She lifted her head again, uncertain what she was expected to do, and found that he was still watching her with the same unreadable calm. There was no mockery in his expression, no impatience. Only patience. Deep, unsettling patience. Mara took one careful step forward, then another, her shoes barely making a sound on the polished floor. Every movement felt magnified. Every breath felt deliberate. She became aware of the way her hands trembled at her sides and forced them still. The candlelight traced the sharp line of his profile, the clean strength of his jaw, the dark brightness of his eyes. He looked like a man carved out of midnight and command, yet there was something in his stillness that made her think of restraint, of a force carefully contained rather than freely given. You are not from this place, he said at last. Mara hesitated. She could hear the faint rustle of silk, the soft shift of someone standing farther back in the room, but no one spoke. Not until she did. No, my lord, she answered quietly. The title came out before she could stop it. His gaze did not change, though she thought she saw the smallest flicker of interest at the edge of it. And yet you came. Mara felt the truth of that settle over her. She had come because there had been no other road left open to her. Because the forest, the cold, and the long night had all led her here. Because something in her had refused to turn away when every sensible part of her had begged to keep moving. I did, she said. There was a pause. Not an awkward one. A measured one. As though he were listening for more than her words. Mara sensed that he was weighing everything about her. Her face, her scent, The careful way she held herself as if she had learned long ago that being too visible could be dangerous. Yet he did not dismiss her. He did not look away. That alone made her pulse quicken. Then, he said softly, "You are braver than most." The words struck her with unexpected force. No one had called her brave in years. Most had called her quiet, or strange, or easy to overlook. She did not know what to do with praise spoken so plainly, especially from a man whose presence made the entire chamber feel smaller. Before she could answer, a servant appeared with a tray of water and a folded cloth, offering them without meeting her eyes. Mara accepted both with careful fingers. The water was cool. The cloth smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. She dipped the cloth and pressed it to her wrist, suddenly aware of how dry her skin had become after the long journey. The man at the table noticed everything. She could feel it, not in a harsh way, but in the quiet, steady manner of someone who missed nothing. "You are tired," he said. Mara gave the smallest nod. Tired was too simple a word for the ache in her bones, but it was the only one she could trust. "Then sit," he said. The command was gentle, yet impossible to mistake. A chair had already been left open near the table, close enough that she could not ignore the significance of it. Mara looked at it, then at him, and something in her chest shifted uneasily. To be offered a seat this near to him was not a casual kindness. It was a statement, a choice made in public, before all of them. She sat slowly, aware that the room had changed around her again. It was subtle, but it was there. A ripple of attention, a recalculation. The servants avoided looking at her now for a different reason. The guard seemed even more rigid than before. Mara rested her hands in her lap and tried to steady her breathing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of questions she did not yet know how to ask. Then his voice returned, even lower than before. "Tell me your name." Mara looked up, and this time she did not look away. "Mara," she said. Something unreadable passed through his eyes at the sound of it. Not surprise, not recognition. Something deeper and harder to name, as if her name had touched a memory he had not expected to feel. He leaned back slightly, one finger brushing the edge of the goblet beside him, and the movement was so controlled it felt deliberate in itself. "Mara," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. Then, after a brief silence that seemed to stretch the entire room thin, he said, "You were not meant to arrive here by accident." The words settled over her like a veil. Mara felt the air shift again, felt the room hold its breath around them, and for the first time since entering the chamber, she understood that the evening had already begun to move beyond her control. The man across from her was not merely observing. He was guiding, waiting, perhaps even recognizing her in some way she could not yet see. And in the quiet glow of the candles, with every eye in the room fixed on the space between them, Mara felt fate draw one step closer, patient and certain, as if the night itself had been leading her to this chair all along. The silence after Mara's name did not break. It deepened. Candles trembled along the length of the chamber, their flames bending as if the room itself were breathing around her. Mara kept her hands folded in her lap, every muscle in her body fixed with the effort of seeming calm, though her pulse had turned wild beneath her skin. Across from her, the man who had guided the evening with so few words remained still, his attention settled on her with a patience that felt more intimate than any open stare. It was not the look of a stranger measuring a stranger. It was the look of someone piecing together a truth that had already begun to reveal itself. Around them, the others waited in guarded quiet, as though they sensed the balance of the room had changed and no one wished to be the first to disturb it. Mara lifted her gaze only enough to meet his eyes. There was no softness in them, not exactly, but there was restraint. There was purpose, and beneath that, something else she could not name without fearing it might name her in return. He set down his goblet with measured care and spoke in a voice low enough that only she and the nearest hush could hear it. "You have been carrying yourself as if you expect to be sent away." Mara did not answer. She could not trust her voice to remain steady. The truth was too near, too exposed. He watched her a moment longer, then turned one hand palm up on the table, an invitation so subtle it might have been mistaken for nothing at all. Yet she felt the weight of it. Not pressure. Choice. No one had offered her that kind of space in a long time. Not in the places she had come from. Not in the rooms that had taught her to lower her eyes and make herself smaller, so other people could feel larger. Here, that habit seemed almost impossible to keep. The chamber was too still, the air too charged, the expectation too carefully held. Mara finally breathed in, slow and careful, and when she spoke, her voice came out quieter than she wanted but clearer than she feared. People usually do. His expression changed then, only slightly, but enough. Something in him went still in a different way, as if her answer had reached farther than a simple conversation. "And do you believe them?" he asked. Mara looked down at her own hands for a single heartbeat, then back up. The answer should have been easy. It had been easy, once, because believing what others said about her had been the simplest way to survive it. But the room around her was no longer built on survival alone. It was built on witnessing, on waiting, on the strange, quiet courage of being seen. "No," she said. The words seemed to settle the chamber more firmly than any proclamation could have done. For the first time that evening, she noticed how many of the faces around them had turned toward her with something less than judgment. Some looked curious. Some looked uncertain. A few looked almost startled, as though they had expected her to shrink and had instead found her standing in place. The man across from her lowered his gaze to the table for a brief moment, as if considering some unseen line drawn between them, and when he looked back, there was a faint shift in him that Mara felt more than saw. Recognition. Not yet certainty, but enough to alter the shape of the night. "Good," he said, and the single word carried more warmth than any speech. It was not praise exactly. It was approval, quiet and deliberate, as though he were answering something she had not spoken aloud. Mara felt the tension in her chest loosen by a fraction. The chamber had not become safe, not by any means, but it no longer felt like a place prepared to swallow her whole. It felt, instead, like the edge of something larger, something waiting to be named. Outside, somewhere beyond the high stone walls, the wind moved through the trees with a low, restless sound. Inside, the candles burned steady. The man stood, and the room seemed to rise with him in instinctive awareness, though he did not ask for that attention. He only extended a hand toward Mara, not to command, but to accompany. "Come," he said. "There is something you should see before the night ends." Mara stared at his hand for the briefest moment, every old warning in her body telling her to hesitate, every new instinct telling her that hesitation would mean turning away from the very thing fate had been bringing her toward. Then she placed her fingers in his palm. His hand was warm, steady, certain, and as he closed his fingers lightly around hers, Mara understood that the evening had crossed a threshold she could never step back over. The room watched in complete silence as they moved together toward the far doors, their footsteps soft against the stone. No one stopped them. No one dared. Because something had already changed in the space between the first look and this one, something old enough to feel written in the walls themselves. Mara did not know what waited beyond those doors. She only knew that the man leading her there had never once spoken to her, as though she were less than she was. And for the first time in her life, that alone felt like the beginning of a destiny she had not yet earned, but perhaps had always been meant to meet. Mara let her hand remain in his for one quiet breath longer, as though she were learning the shape of safety by touch alone. The doors ahead stood tall and pale in the lamplight, but the world behind them had already begun to fade. Around them, the murmurs of the hall thinned into silence, replaced by the soft echo of their steps and the faint rustle of fabric over stone. He did not hurry her. That, more than anything, unsettled her in the gentlest way. She had spent so many years being pushed, corrected, dismissed, and measured by people who never paused to ask what she wanted. Now, with his hand steady around hers, she felt the strange, trembling weight of being allowed to choose her own pace. The corridor beyond the doors was long and lined with carved pillars, each one lit by a flame that seemed to shimmer as they passed. Mara could feel the attention of the castle itself, as if old walls were listening, remembering. Beside her, he remained silent, but not distant. His presence was calm, grounded, almost impossible to read, and yet she found herself noticing the smallest things, the measured rhythm of his breathing, the way his thumbs shifted once against her knuckles, the effortless control in every step. It should have made him feel untouchable. Instead, it made him feel real. At the far end of the corridor, a pair of attendants lowered their eyes and stepped aside without being asked. Mara saw it happen. She saw the quick glance of recognition, the instant of reverence, the careful way their bodies yielded before he ever spoke. Still, he did not use that power to impress her. He simply guided her onward, as if the only thing that mattered was bringing her safely into the next moment. A sudden warmth gathered in her chest, so sharp and unfamiliar that it almost hurt. Not because she was afraid, because she was beginning to hope. They reached a smaller chamber at last, one softer than the hall behind them, with open windows and a view of the moonlit grounds below. Silver light lay across the floor in long, quiet bands. A table had been set with tea, fresh bread, and fruit she had not expected to see at this hour. Nothing in the room was excessive. Nothing tried too hard. It all felt arranged with care, as if someone had considered comfort before grandeur. Mara stood still at the threshold, her fingers still resting in his, and looked around with guarded wonder. She had entered many rooms in her life feeling like an intrusion. This one did not feel that way. It felt like being invited. He released her hand only to gesture lightly toward the window. "You can stand there if you like," he said, his voice low and even. "The air is clearer by the glass." The simple kindness of the offer made her throat tighten. She crossed the room and stood where he indicated, looking out over the dark grounds. Lanterns flickered in the distance. Trees moved like soft shadows beneath the night sky. Somewhere beyond the walls, the pack continued its life, unaware that the course of one fragile evening had quietly shifted. Mara wrapped her arms around herself, not from cold, but from the intensity of what she felt gathering inside her. She did not understand all of it yet. The way he watched her, the way everyone else had stepped aside, the way her own heart now beat with a strange and steady insistence, as if it recognized a truth her mind had not caught up to. Behind her, he poured tea with unhurried precision, the small sound of porcelain against what felt almost sacred in the silence. "You are not expected to say anything tonight," he told her. "Not unless you want to." Mara turned slowly, surprised by how much that mattered. Most people demanded answers from her before offering even a moment of rest. Most people treated silence as weakness. But here, in this quiet room lit by moonlight, silence felt like mercy. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not the ruler the castle feared, but a man whose restraint seemed to protect more than it controlled. There was something in the set of his shoulders, in the careful way he stood, that suggested a life spent holding power without letting it turn cruel. For the first time, she wondered what it cost him to be that composed, that exact, that unshaken. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked at last, the question barely above a whisper. He did not answer at once. When he did, it was with a quietness that made her listen harder. "Because you have spent too long being met with the opposite." The words settled over her like a blanket she had not known she needed. Mara lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by the ache of being understood so simply, so directly. No one had ever spoken to her as though kindness were the default she had been denied. No one had ever made her feel that her bruised heart deserved gentleness instead of suspicion. And there, in the moonlit chamber, she felt something inside her begin to unclench. Not fully, not all at once, but enough to know that the night was no longer the same night she had entered. Something had opened. Something had answered. The room seemed to hold its breath as he lifted a cup and set it on the table near her hands. Their fingers did not touch again, yet the space between them felt charged, alive with a promise neither of them had spoken. Mara stared at the tea, then at the window, then back at him, and in the quiet that followed, she understood that destiny did not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it came as a door held open, a voice that did not demand, and a hand that never once made her feel she needed to flinch. And as the moon rose higher above the castle, its pale light washing the room in silver, Mara felt the first careful pulse of a future she had once believed was reserved for other people. Not anymore. The tea had gone cold before Mara realized her hands were trembling. She closed them around the cup anyway, letting the warmth seep into her palms as the silence between them stretched soft and careful. Across the room, the Alpha King stood near the window, one shoulder angled toward the moonlit glass, his posture relaxed in a way that still felt impossible to her. He did not loom. He did not demand. He simply remained there, as if giving her time was its own kind of vow. Mara lowered her gaze to the silver surface of the tea and breathed in slowly. The scent was faintly floral, with a sweetness that reminded her of spring mornings and open fields she had not seen in years. It was such a small thing, and yet it nearly undid her. Small kindnesses always seemed to reach the places harsh words had spent years hardening. "You have not touched it," he said at last, his voice low and even. Mara looked up, caught off guard by the gentleness of his tone. "I did not know if it was meant for me," she admitted. Something almost like sorrow moved through his eyes, though it passed so quickly she might have imagined it. "It is yours," he said. "Nothing here was ever placed in front of you by accident." The words settled over her like a blanket she had not realized she needed. She turned the cup once in her hands, studying the delicate steam rising from it. And for a moment she thought of all the times she had been given scraps, borrowed places, and half-hearted promises that were never meant to last. This was different. He had given her a seat. He had given her quiet. He had given her room to decide what to do with both. Outside, the wind moved through the high branches beyond the castle walls, and the sound came faintly through the window like a distant whisper from another world. Mara listened to it, and felt something in her chest loosen again. Not heal. Not yet. But soften. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked before she could stop herself. The question slipped out raw and honest, and once it was spoken, she wished she could pull it back. It felt too bare, too close to the truth she had spent so long avoiding. For a long moment, he did not answer. When he finally turned from the window, the moonlight caught the sharp line of his face and turned it into something almost solemn. "Because no one should have to earn gentleness," he said. The answer was so simple that it left her breathless. Mara stared at him, unable to find a reply. In her experience, kindness always came attached to a condition. A favor, a debt, a price. But his words did not sound like a bargain. They sounded like a truth he had carried for a very long time. He crossed the room then, stopping only when he reached the table, close enough that she could feel the quiet strength of him without fear of being cornered by it. He placed a folded cloth beside her cup, then rested one hand on the back of the chair across from her, not touching her, only grounding the space between them. "Eat," he said softly. "Rest. Ask what you need." Mara lowered her eyes again, fighting the strange ache rising behind them. No one had spoken to her like that in years, perhaps ever. Not as a burden, not as a problem, as if her comfort mattered. Her fingers slowly released the cup. She reached for the cloth and unfolded it to find bread still warm from the kitchen, a little butter, and sliced pears arranged with quiet care. The sight of it was so ordinary that it felt almost sacred. Her throat tightened. "This is too much," she whispered. "No," he said at once, and there was no hardness in it. Only certainty. "It is enough." The simplicity of that answer made her chest ache in a new way. Enough. Not too little. Not too late. Just enough. The moon climbed higher, and its light shifted across the floor, silvering the edges of the table, the chair, the cup in her hands. Mara took one small bite, then another. The bread was soft. The butter melted on her tongue. The pear was cool and sweet. She had not realized how hungry she was until the first real taste of food made her eyes sting. She looked down quickly, unwilling to cry in front of him, but he had already turned his face slightly away, as if granting her even that privacy. A sound came from the corridor then, faint and distant, the measured steps of someone passing by. Mara stiffened instinctively, her shoulders tightening. He noticed at once. "You are safe here," he said, not loudly, not as a command, but with the calm certainty of someone stating the weather. "No one enters without my leave." The words should have been ordinary. Instead, they touched something deep and old inside her, something built from nights spent listening for danger, from mornings spent hoping no one would remember she was there. Safe. The word felt unreal, almost fragile, as if speaking too loudly might break it. She held on to it anyway. Across from her, the Alpha King remained still, patient as stone and warm as firelight, and Mara found herself wondering not whether he was truly dangerous, but how a man with so much power had learned to offer it so gently. And in the quiet of that question, with moonlight washing over the room and the future waiting just beyond the next breath, she realized that whatever had begun between them was no longer only about protection. It was about being seen and not turning away. It was about a door left open long enough for trust to walk in. Mara felt the change before she understood it. It was in the way the room seemed to widen around her, in the way every sound became sharper and more alive, in the way the Alpha King looked at her, as if he had been waiting for this quiet moment long before she ever stepped through his door. The silver light from the window traced the edge of his face, softened the hard lines that others feared, and turned his silence into something almost reverent. Mara stood with her hands folded lightly before her, unsure what to do with the strange warmth gathering in her chest. No one had ever looked at her like she belonged anywhere. Not truly. Not like this. Not like the world had paused just long enough to let her breathe. He spoke at last, his voice low and steady. "You are safe here." The words settled into the room like a blanket laid over cold shoulders. Mara lowered her eyes, not because she wished to hide, but because the kindness in his tone made her feel suddenly seen in a way that was almost unbearable. She had spent so long learning how to make herself smaller, how to take up less space, how to move through life like a shadow that did not deserve to leave a mark. But in front of him, that old habit began to loosen. The night outside pressed softly against the glass, the moon bright above the trees, and somewhere beyond the walls, the pack continued with its endless rules, its careful hierarchies, its quiet fears. None of that reached her here. Here, there was only the hush of the room, the steady presence of the man before her, and the unsettling realization that safety did not always feel like distance from danger. Sometimes it felt like being close enough to another heart to hear its truth. The Alpha King watched her with a patience that did not demand anything from her, and that patience itself was its own kind of mercy. Mara had expected commands, suspicion, perhaps even that cold measure of authority that others wore like armor. Instead, she found none of it. He asked nothing from her but honesty, and even that felt offered rather than taken. "If you wish to leave, you may," he said after a moment, his gaze never once hardening. "But if you stay, no one enters without my leave." Mara felt the weight of those words not as a chain, but as a promise. It was not possession. It was protection. It was the rarest thing she had ever been given. Her throat tightened, and for a heartbeat she feared the tears gathering there might betray her. She blinked them back and looked up, meeting his eyes fully for the first time. There was power there. Yes, the kind that could command a room without effort, but beneath it was something she had not expected to find in a king. Restraint. Care. A quiet refusal to let strength become cruelty. And in that moment, Mara understood why the fear around him had never seemed complete. Fear could make people obey. It could not make them trust. He seemed to understand that. The fire in the hearth shifted, sending a brief glow across the stone floor, and Mara felt as if the room itself had become a threshold. Behind her was the old life where she had been overlooked, dismissed, and kept at the edge of every circle. Ahead of her was something she did not yet have words for, only the sense that it had been waiting through all the years she had survived alone. The Alpha King's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, as if he had seen the exact moment her heart began to unclench. He did not rush it. He simply stood there and let silence do what force never could. And Mara, who had always been told to be grateful for scraps of kindness, found herself standing before a man who offered her an entire room, an open door, and the chance to decide for herself whether she believed in it. In the stillness, she did. Not all at once. Not easily. But enough. The room had gone quiet in that way only great houses could manage, as if even the walls were listening for what Mara would do next. She kept her hands folded so no one could see how badly they trembled, though the tremor had little to do with fear now. It was the strange, delicate ache of being seen after years of being passed over. Across from her, the Alpha King did not look away. He stood with a stillness that made the air feel narrower, yet somehow safer too, and Mara realized that his patience was not absence. It was restraint. It was choice. The servants who had once hurried past her with lowered eyes now paused at the edges of the chamber, uncertain how to meet the change settling over the room. No one spoke first. Then the king reached for a small silver key resting on the table beside him and set it in her palm. His fingers brushed hers only for a moment, but the contact lingered in her chest like warmth left by sunlight on stone. "This belongs to you," he said quietly. Mara looked down at the key, then back at him. "What does it open?" she asked, and there was no hardness in her voice, only caution, the kind born from a life that had taught her not to hope too quickly. His gaze held hers, steady and unreadable in the way deep water can be. "A door no one has let you enter before," he answered. The words should have sounded simple. They did not. They felt like a promise made with both hands. Mara swallowed, her throat tight with the urge to believe him and the memory of every time belief had cost her something. Still, she did not return the key. She closed her fingers around it instead. From the corridor came the faint sound of footsteps and then a pause, as though someone had stopped to witness the moment without daring to interrupt it. The Alpha King turned his head toward the doorway, acknowledging the presence there without granting it power. When he looked back at Mara, something in his expression had sharpened into purpose. "Tonight," he said, "you will not stand at the edge of anything. You will sit where you are meant to sit." Mara did not know whether the sentence frightened her more than it comforted her. She only knew that the old world, with its familiar smallness, was already beginning to feel distant. And when the king offered his arm, not as a command but as an invitation, she hesitated just long enough to understand the weight of the moment. Then she placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. The entire chamber seemed to inhale with them. Together, they crossed the threshold,